I welcome the opportunity to speak on this bill, Ceann Comhairle, and I can say at the outset that Fianna Fáil will be supporting its provisions, and we hope to see it pass through the houses of the Oireachtas as quickly as possible. As the Minister said in his speech, the catalyst for the introduction of this legislation is the Istanbul Convention, and it's important that we enact this legislation so that we can ratify that convention that was signed in May of 2011. I think there were 45 countries that signed up to the Istanbul Convention against the violence against women, but as of yet only 33 countries have been able to ratify it in full. It's disappointing, I suppose, that Ireland has delayed in its ratification, but nonetheless I welcome the fact that once this legislative hurdle has been overcome, we'll be in a position to ratify the convention in full. As the Minister pointed out, I think it's also important to note that the legislation that we're introducing here today does not simply apply to violent acts against women. It also applies to any violent acts against men. The bill in itself defines what a relevant offence is, and I think it's important that we're aware of what offences we're talking about here for the purpose of making sure that those offences can be prosecuted here if it is the case that they are also offences in other convention countries. The bill provides that sections 3, 4, 5, 9 and 10 of the Non-Fatal Offences Against the Person Act 1997 are relevant offences for the purpose of this bill. And the offences covered by those sections are offences such as assault causing harm, assault causing serious harm, threats to kill or cause serious harm, coercion and harassment. And in many of the cases, the majority of those criminal offences are, I regret to say, committed against women. It is why the Istanbul Convention expressly provided that criminal acts such as those had to be criminalised, outlawed in countries, and this extraterritorial provision had to be put in place in convention countries. It also applies to other offences, which for instance are sexual assault within the meaning of Section 2 of the 1990 Act, aggravated sexual assault and rape under the 1990 Act or otherwise. Again, regrettably, it's the case that those are offences, whether nationally or internationally, which are committed predominantly and overwhelmingly against women. But as the Minister has stated, although this legislation has as its focus the Istanbul Convention and protecting women from violence, it nonetheless will have application in respect of those offences if they're committed against men or women. I think, however, it's important to point out that there is a problem nationally and internationally with violence against women. And it is regrettable that we have to and we should recognise that in this House by looking at the statistics which exist in respect of domestic statistics in respect of violence against women, but also the international context. And we know from the international context that 25% of all violent crimes reported involve a man assaulting his wife or partner. And we know that statistic from the European Union campaign against domestic violence, which was completed in the year 2000. We know that at least 1 in 3 women have been beaten, coerced into sex, or otherwise abused in their lifetimes. We also know from a British crime survey that was carried out in 2009-2010 that 7% of women between 16 and 59 were victims of domestic violence in the previous year. And it is regrettably the case that all international research consistently shows that a woman is more likely to be assaulted, injured, raped or killed by a current or former partner than by any other person. And regrettably in this country, we know that's the case when it comes to the murder of women. Since 1996, 216 women have died violently in this country and 63% were killed in their own homes. So it is the case that there's an international problem and there's a domestic problem in respect of violence against women. I think it is appropriate that we send out a consistent message that such violence is unacceptable and cannot be tolerated. One of the great, I suppose, advantages of what's happened over the past 70 years is that there has been increased international cooperation The finest example of that is the European Union, Council of Europe, but it's also been the case in other countries since the Second World War that they've increased their international cooperation with other countries. It has seen many successes in the area of trade and the Pacific settlement of disputes. However, another area where it's had a significant improvement is in respect of the criminal law. We see it with the European arrest warrant and how that is beneficially used in order to ensure that people who commit crimes in one country in the European Union can be held to account in the country where those crimes were committed, even though they've moved to another jurisdiction within the Union. This is another interesting and advanced development, because what it will do is it will allow this state to prosecute people who've been involved in the offences I've just described in other convention countries, but they can be prosecuted in this country, provided the offence is an offence in the convention country. It is the case predominantly that these are and will become offences in the convention countries, because you couldn't sign up to the Istanbul Convention unless you indicated that these would become particular offences. It's also the case that there are other elements to this legislation which deal with, for instance, murder and manslaughter, which allow us to prosecute in this jurisdiction people who have committed murder or manslaughter elsewhere. This was introduced in respect of Northern Ireland back in the 1970s, when there was controversial legislation introduced in respect of the criminal law, which allowed people who committed murder and manslaughter in Northern Ireland to be prosecuted in this jurisdiction. But I think it's also appropriate that we have in our law, and that there's an international recognition, that murder is so unacceptable that you can be prosecuted in a country where the crime didn't occur on the basis of the fact that there's a common interest and recognition in countries that murder is so unacceptable, and the same applies to manslaughter as well. The legislation, obviously, if it's enacted, we'll hope it will be the case that if there are criminal acts committed in other countries which come within the parameters of this bill, that they will be prosecuted in this country. That will be difficult for prosecutorial authorities, because they'll have to ensure that there is evidence available to prosecute the people here. So if somebody committed a crime out in Greece, say the crime of sexual assault, obviously to prosecute it here will give rise to difficulties. We'll have to have the witnesses here in order to prove it. But in a lot of these instances, what it is doing is it's providing the ability for instance, an Irish victim who was in Greece to have their case prosecuted here. And there should be cooperation in respect to that. At present, it's always the case that the accused can only be prosecuted in the jurisdiction where the crime has been committed. That places huge burdens upon the victims of those crimes. We've seen it here before, where people who have been assaulted or attacked or their loved ones killed in Ireland have had to travel from abroad to come here to have the trial operate effectively in this jurisdiction. So it seems to me sensible that if it is possible that the place where the victim is based could also be the locus for the prosecution of that crime. That won't reduce the obligation on the prosecution to ensure that the relevant witnesses are here. They still have to ensure that, and they'll still have to prove their case beyond all reasonable doubt. But I do think it's a sign of increased and improved international cooperation. And just, I know my colleague, Deputy O'Loughlin, I'm going to hand over to in a minute or two, but I think it is important to note that at a time when international cooperation is being criticised, and at a time when we see in Brexit and the policies of the United States where people are trying to resile from international cooperation, I think it's important that the Council of Europe and this House sends out a strong message that international cooperation is a positive development. And I think we should also send out a strong message that trying to turn your back on international cooperation is a regressive step. I know we don't want to interfere in the events of other countries who are taking steps away from international cooperation, but I think in this House we can say that it is a regressive step, and it is an attempt to, hold back the course of history. It's not just all about globalisation, it's also about international cooperation in vital areas such as protecting women from violence around the world, and ensuring that we have in our laws a system whereby people can be held to account for their offences, irrespective of where they are committed. I welcome what Minister Stanton said about the fact that this is the last step we have to take before we can ratify the Istanbul Convention. I hope we'll be able to ratify the Istanbul Convention this year, but let nobody be any doubt, this country and indeed the world still faces a huge challenge in sending forward a message that the violence against women is simply unacceptable. And regrettably, it is the case that men in this country and internationally seem to think that, or certain men seem to think that, it is permissible, it is acceptable to inflict violence upon women with whom you're having a close relationship. It's totally unacceptable, and we need to send out that strong message. And not just a message by way of legislation, but we need to send out a message to young men who are growing up in an environment which is much more difficult than the environment Minister Stanton and I grew up in, where they're now exposed to an assessment and an appraisal of women from what they view on the internet, which presents women in a malleable and submissive way. So we need to ensure that we send out a strong message in this country that just as it is unacceptable to inflict violence upon anyone, it's particularly unacceptable to do it in the context of a relationship in which you're in. And I want to conclude on that point, and I'll hand over to my colleague, Deputy O'Loughlin.